She thought the worst thing that could happen to her that night was dropping a glass. She was wrong. Ilara Voss stood at the edge of a Manhattan ballroom filled with 500 people, who all pretended not to notice the way her husband's fingers had just found her wrist beneath the tablecloth and squeezed, slowly, deliberately, until the crystal slipped from her hand and shattered across the marble floor. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Grant Holloway laughed, and every single person in that room laughed with him. If you've ever watched someone you love get destroyed in public and done nothing, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The car had smelled like leather and something else. Something underneath the leather, synthetic and cold. The kind of smell that came from a vehicle cleaned too thoroughly, too often, by people who were paid to ask no questions. Ilara noticed it every time. She'd been noticing it for 3 years. She sat in the back of the town car with her hands folded in her lap, her posture the way Grant liked it, straight, composed, invisible. Outside, Manhattan scrolled past the tinted windows in long stripes of gold and white, the kind of city light that made everything look like a movie set, a beautiful lie laid over concrete and exhaustion. She watched a woman in a yellow coat hail a cab on Fifth Avenue and felt something she couldn't name. Not quite envy, not quite grief. Something thinner than both. "You're doing that thing again," Grant said without looking up from his phone. "What thing?" "The staring thing. The daydreaming." He finally glanced at her, and his expression was the one she'd learned to read first. The flat-eyed assessment, the quiet inventory of what she was wearing, how she'd done her hair, whether she was going to be an asset or a liability tonight. "You look fine. Don't overthink it." She hadn't said anything about how she looked. Grant Holloway was 39 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that photographed beautifully and meant nothing in a room. He had a jaw like a campaign poster and eyes that were the pale gray of winter sky just before a storm. Not interesting gray, not complicated gray. Just empty. She'd mistaken the emptiness for depth once. That had been her first mistake, and it had cost her 4 years of her life. 1 year of falling for someone who wasn't there, and 3 years of paying for it. Tonight was the Meridian Foundation Gala. Black tie. The St. Regis Ballroom. 500 of New York's wealthiest people assembled to perform generosity at $1,200 a plate, and Grant Holloway was set to give the keynote address about affordable housing, a subject he'd made a fortune circumventing. Ilara knew this. She'd read the documents once, the ones he left on his desk when he was confident she wasn't paying attention. She'd been paying attention for 2 years. She just hadn't known what to do with it yet. The town car stopped. A doorman materialized and opened her door. Grant was already stepping out on his side, straightening his jacket, running one hand through his silver-streaked hair with the practiced ease of a man who'd rehearsed his own entrances. "Smile," he said, and offered her his arm. She took it. She smiled. She had learned to do both without thinking. What? The ballroom was the kind of room that made ordinary people feel like they'd wandered into someone else's life by mistake. 40-foot ceilings hung with chandeliers that threw gold light across everything. The tables draped in ivory linen, the flower arrangements taller than children, the crowd of people in suits and gowns moving through the space with the particular confidence of those who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. Ilara had grown up in a college town in Ohio. She remembered the first time Grant brought her to a room like this, how she'd stood just inside the door for a moment, dizzy with it all. Now she just felt tired. They moved through the crowd the way they always did, Grant shaking hands and laughing his big laugh, the one that filled rooms and meant nothing. Ilara slightly behind him, nodding when introduced, saying the correct things in the correct order. She'd gotten good at it. She'd gotten frighteningly good at a lot of things she'd never wanted to learn. The table they were seated at was round with 8 chairs, occupied by the kind of people whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. Marcus Hale, the hedge fund manager who collected Basquiat pieces and was under quiet investigation for tax irregularities no one discussed openly. Constance Rourke, whose family had been in Manhattan real estate longer than most of the buildings. A couple from Greenwich whose names Ilara immediately forgot, and 2 younger men from Grant's firm who sat too straight and laughed half a second after Grant did, always. A waiter appeared at Ilara's shoulder and set down a crystal champagne flute. She picked it up. She wasn't going to drink it. She rarely drank at these events because she needed her mind clear and her face neutral, and drinking made the mask slip. But holding the glass gave her hands something to do. Grant was talking. He was always talking at these events, voice pitched to carry just far enough, each story shaped like a performance rather than a conversation. He was telling Marcus Hale something about a property deal in Long Island City, and his hand found Alara's wrist beneath the edge of the tablecloth, the way it always did when he was making a point to someone else. Not a caress, not an accident, just pressure. A reminder. She didn't react. She'd learned not to. Alara used to teach literature, Grant said abruptly, turning to include her in the conversation with the tone he used when he was setting something up. Columbia, before. Before. He always said it like that. Before. Oh, that's wonderful, Constance Rourke said politely. She wrote her dissertation on Edith Wharton. Grant smiled at Alara, and it was the smile she'd first fallen in love with. Wide, warm, devastating. She knew now it was a weapon with teeth. The age of innocence. What was it, Alara? Something about women trapped by social expectation? The table laughed mildly. Alara's hand tightened on the glass stem. Basically, she said. She gave it up, Grant continued, to no one in particular, with the easy confidence of a man narrating someone else's life. Some people aren't built for that world. They need something more. He searched for the word with theatrical care. Domestic. The pressure on her wrist increased. The glass slipped. It happened fast. The flute sliding from her fingers, the liquid arcing briefly through the light, the crystal detonating against the marble floor with a sound that split the conversation at nearby tables like a thunderclap. The silence was immediate and absolute, the kind that fell in public spaces when something went wrong that everyone was pretending not to have witnessed. Alara looked at the wreckage on the floor, the scattered diamonds of broken crystal, the champagne spreading darkly across the marble, and felt something inside her chest go very still. Well, Grant said. He said it into the silence, perfectly timed, conversationally devastating. I suppose we know why she left academia. The laughter that followed was polite, brief, the laughter of people who were uncomfortable and wanted the moment to end. Alara felt it like something physical, not pain, she was past pain by then, but a particular variety of shame that she associated only with Grant, the kind that had been installed so slowly she hadn't noticed it happening until it was load-bearing. She thought about what she used to be like at 31, sitting in front of 80 undergraduates talking about the House of Mirth, about Lily Bart falling in carefully observed stages toward a ruin she couldn't prevent. She'd cried in her office once, rereading the ending. She hadn't understood back then how fast descent could feel like standing still. She understood now. She pushed back from the table, murmured something about freshening up, and walked out of the ballroom with her head high and her jaw locked, and her hands, mercifully hidden, shaking. The terrace was off the second floor, accessible through a pair of glass doors that few people bothered to open because October in Manhattan was not garden party weather. The night was cold and clear, the city spread below in its indifferent, gorgeous entirety. The dark rectangle of Central Park punched into the grid of lights, the buildings rising around it like sentinels of steel and glass. Alara pressed both palms against the stone railing and breathed. In, out, in. She'd gotten good at this too. The recalibration, the reset. Pressing down the thing that was rising in her chest and covering it over with composure the way you'd press a wound. She heard the terrace door open behind her. She didn't turn. The salmon is better than it looks, a man's voice said. That's not a strong endorsement, I know. She turned. He was standing just outside the doorway, hands in the pockets of a jacket that cost more than most people's rent. And he was looking at her not the way men at these events usually looked at her, as an accessory, a footnote, a wife, but the way someone looked at something they were actually trying to understand. He was dark-haired, somewhere in his early 40s, with a face that had earned its severity. Not beautiful exactly, but precise. The features arranged with a kind of deliberate economy. Nothing wasted. His eyes were very dark and very still, and there was something in them that Alara recognized without being able to name. I didn't want the salmon, she said. No. He moved to the railing, leaving several feet between them, and looked out at the park. You wanted to be anywhere but in that room. She should have found this presumptuous. She didn't. Damien Vale, he said without offering his hand. She knew the name. Most people in New York knew the name. Damien Vale was the kind of billionaire who appeared in the financial press rather than the social pages, who had built a real estate empire through means that the Times described diplomatically as aggressive consolidation, who was known for being difficult to read and worse to negotiate against, who kept no public profile to speak of, and seemed to prefer it that way. He was also, she now recalled, someone Grant had mentioned with a particular quality of resentment that he reserved for people he considered competition. Elara Voss, she said. Holloway. Elara Holloway. Something flickered across his face. Not pity. She would have flinched from pity. Something quieter. Recognition. I know who you are, he said. I know who he is. She looked back at the park. Everyone knows who he is. That's not what I meant. The cold was biting now, and she hadn't brought her wrap. She could feel it across her bare shoulders and down her arms, and she didn't move toward the door because the cold was at least real, and real things had become precious to her in ways she couldn't explain. He does that often, Damien Vale said. He wasn't looking at her. His voice was flat, uninflected, the question neutral in a way that made it somehow more pointed. I dropped a glass. He squeezed your wrist until you dropped a glass. She went very still. The table was at a certain angle, he said. I had a clear sight line. Don't... He paused. Don't bother. She didn't say anything. I've seen that particular routine before, he said. And now there was something underneath the flat tone, something dark and old and carefully contained. Not from him, someone else, a long time ago. He stopped. It doesn't get better. You don't know my situation. No. He finally turned to look at her. You're right. I don't. He held her gaze for a moment, direct, uncomfortable, the gaze of someone accustomed to looking at things other people looked away from. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the stone railing between them. A card. Plain white. A phone number. No name. If you need something. She looked at the card but didn't pick it up. The terrace door swung open. There you are, Grant's voice, warm and social and completely controlled. He stepped out onto the terrace and took in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Elara at the railing, Damien Vale 2 feet away, the space between them. The card. His jaw tightened by a fraction that only she would have noticed. Holloway, Damien said. His tone was completely pleasant and completely without warmth. Good speech. Vale. Grant's smile appeared, and it was perfect. Didn't know you'd be here tonight. I bought a table. I didn't eat the salmon. There was a pause. 3 seconds of the kind of male silence that was really a different kind of conversation. And then Grant's hand was at the small of Elara's back, light and immovable. We're about to do the presentation, he said to her. She picked up the card. She didn't look at either of them when she did it. She slipped it into the small clutch she was carrying and felt it there, the weight of it, as Grant steered her back through the glass doors and into the warm, impossible light of the ballroom. She didn't sleep that night, not because of what happened at the gala, or not only because of that. What happened at the gala was the familiar shape of her life, and she'd made a kind of uneasy peace with familiar shapes. What she couldn't sleep because of was what happened at 2 a.m. in the kitchen of the penthouse on the 43rd floor of a building in Midtown that Grant owned outright and that she had never once felt was her home. She'd been up getting water, she couldn't sleep, and she'd been lying in the dark for 3 hours running the numbers on her life the way she'd started doing lately, calculating, without letting herself acknowledge she was calculating, the specific weight of her dependencies. She didn't have income. She'd left her position at Columbia when she married Grant. His idea, framed as her choice, the way everything was framed as her choice. She didn't have her own accounts. Their finances were fully joined, which had seemed like intimacy at the time and now looked like what it was. She had a sister in Portland who she spoke to occasionally, carefully, around the edges of things she couldn't say. She had a building full of doormen and cleaning staff and security personnel who were all employed by her husband. She had a card in her clutch with a phone number on it. She was standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water when she heard his footsteps. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway in the dark, still in his dress shirt with the tie loosened, and he looked at her with the expression she'd learned to dread most. Not the anger, which was almost easier because it was legible, but the cold, evaluating calm that came before it. The face he put on when he was deciding what she deserved. "You talked to Vale," he said. "He was on the terrace." "I was on the terrace." "You talked to him." "We exchanged 20 words, Grant." He moved into the kitchen. She didn't back up. She'd learned that backing up made it worse, and stood where she was, both hands around the glass, watching him cross the distance between them with the measured, deliberate pace he used when he wanted her to understand that whatever was about to happen was entirely her doing. "Do you know who that man is?" Grant said. "I know who he is. He has been trying to undermine my Long Island City deal for 6 months. 6 months, and you stand on a terrace and talk to him." "Yes, like an adult who was humiliated in public and needed air." She said it before she could stop herself. The words came out level, quieter than she felt, and she watched Grant's face do the thing it did. The very slight shift, the recalibration, as if she'd moved a piece on a board in a way he hadn't anticipated. "What did you say to me?" "I said I was humiliated in public. You made a joke about my career in front of—" "I made a joke." His voice was very soft. "I made a joke, Ilara. Because you dropped a glass like a— You made me drop it." The silence after that was different from the silences at the gala. Those silences were performed. This one was real. Grant looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift behind his eyes. Something that had been held, barely, by the social performance of the evening, the handshakes and the speeches, and the careful public face. And now there was no audience, no performance required, and there was nothing between her and what he actually was. He moved. Fast. Faster than it ever happened in her anticipation of it, his hand finding the front of her dress, and the wall finding her back, and the breath going out of her all at once. And she thought very clearly, as she always did in these moments, that she needed to stop being surprised, that this was not new, that she had known this was coming and had failed to not be here. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said. His voice hadn't risen. It was still soft, conversational, terrible. "And then you went to that terrace, and you talked to the one man in that room who—" "Grant, stop!" "Who has been actively trying to vote—" "Stop." His hand tightened. She felt the wall behind her, the kitchen counter to her left, the geography of the room narrowing. And then something in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time, something that had been dormant under layers of accommodation and fear and the slow erosion of herself, caught like a match. Not hope. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something that had a phone number and a plain white card. Push it. He left the next morning for Chicago. A site inspection, he said. He'd be back Friday. The penthouse felt enormous and very quiet after the town car pulled away from the building, and Ilara stood in the kitchen in the thin autumn light and looked at her own face in the dark reflection of the oven door for a long time. She had bruises on her ribs, on the back of her left arm, on her shoulder where she'd hit the doorframe when she finally moved away from him. Nothing that would show in the clothes she wore. He was always careful about that, in the way of someone who had understood from early on that visible things left evidence. She sat down at the kitchen table and took the card out of the clutch that was still sitting where she'd dropped it when she came home, small and black and belonging to someone else's evening, someone who hadn't yet understood quite how bad things were. A phone number, no name. She thought about what he'd said on the terrace. The stillness in his voice when he said it doesn't get better. The thing underneath the flatness. The dark, old thing that had been contained but not dissolved. She thought about Vivian Cross, whose name she'd found 3 months ago in a quiet Google search she'd conducted from her phone in a coffee shop on Lexington, because she'd stopped using the apartment's Wi-Fi for certain things by then. Vivian Cross, divorce attorney, specializing in high net worth cases. Vivian Cross, whose number she also had, in a different pocket, in different clothes. She thought about the documents on Grant's desk, the things she'd read and photographed on her phone over 2 careful years, the picture sitting in a cloud account she'd opened with an email address Grant didn't know existed. She looked at the bruise on her arm. She picked up her phone. The office of Vivian Cross, attorney at law, was on the 14th floor of a building on Madison Avenue that smelled of wood smoke and recirculated air, and Vivian herself was a small, precise woman in her mid-50s who wore her gray hair short and her expressions carefully rationed, and who listened to Alara speak for 22 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "Tell me you have documentation." "I have 2 years of it." Vivian's expression didn't change. It didn't need to. "Okay." "He has more money than I can calculate. He has lawyers. He has all of those things, yes." Vivian set down her pen. "So do other people. Here's what I need you to understand, Alara." She said the name deliberately, like she was anchoring her to it. "This is going to be hard. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. He will contest everything, delay everything, and attempt to make the process costly enough that you stop. He has done this before." Alara looked at her. "Before?" "You're not his first." Vivian said it simply, without drama. "There was a woman before you. They settled quietly. Significant NDA. I can't discuss the details except to confirm the settlement exists, which is a matter of public record if you know where to look. The kitchen, the wall, the grip." "What will it cost me?" Alara asked. "Financially? Probably everything you accumulated during the marriage initially. He'll freeze assets, claim credit, complicate joint holdings. The first 6 months will feel impossible." Vivian looked at her steadily. "But here's the calculation you actually need to make." She didn't say it, she waited. Alara made herself say it out loud. "Whether staying costs me more." "Yes," Vivian said. "That's the calculation." What? 2 weeks passed. Grant came back from Chicago, and she was what she'd always been. Careful, present, correct. And the terrible thing about being good at a performance was that you couldn't always tell when you'd stopped performing. She moved through the penthouse and the dinners and the events like a person who was still entirely there, because she didn't know how else to do it, because the alternative was a version of herself she hadn't yet figured out how to be. She was practicing quietly in the spaces between. The call came on a Tuesday. Grant was at a business dinner. She wasn't invited, which was fine, which was better than fine. She was sitting in the study she'd made for herself in a spare room on the north side of the apartment, surrounded by books she wasn't reading, when her phone lit up with a number she recognized from a plain white card. She stared at it for 3 rings. She picked up. "I heard about what happened after the gala," Damien Vale said. His voice was the same as it had been on the terrace. Flat, precise, with that controlled quality underneath. Something old and dark held at a careful distance. "Not from you, from other sources." "What sources?" "I had Grant Holloway looked into 6 months ago, for professional reasons. The picture that came back was..." A pause. "Comprehensive." She didn't say anything. "I know about the previous settlement," he said. "I know what you've been living with. I know you've met with an attorney." Another pause. "I know you haven't filed yet." She should have felt violated. She should have felt angry at the surveillance of it, the presumption. She felt, instead, an overwhelming and frightening relief. The relief of someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing alone in the dark and had suddenly found another person standing there who could see them. "Why are you calling me?" she said. "Because you have until Friday. He comes back Friday, and based on his schedule and his current financial situation," his voice was careful, deliberate, "I believe he's going to want to consolidate his position, quickly. And I think you understand what that means." She understood. "You have a choice," Damien Vale said. "You can wait. You can try to manage this in the ordinary legal timeline, which will be very slow and very costly, and which will require you to remain in proximity to him for months. Or you leave tonight." She stood up from the chair she was sitting in. The study was dark, except for the lamp on the desk, and outside the window the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent and luminous and completely without interest in what happened in any individual apartment on any individual floor. "Tonight," she said, "I have a secure location. I have a legal team that will move faster than anything he can mount. I have..." He stopped. "I have reasons for doing this that I will explain to you in person. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust what you already know about your own situation." Her hand was very steady on the phone. She found this remarkable. She thought about the bruises that had faded but not vanished. She thought about the documents in the cloud. She thought about Vivian Cross saying you're not his first. She thought about Damien Vale on the terrace in the October cold, setting down a card and not looking at her when he said it doesn't get better. She thought about the Edith Wharton dissertation she'd written at 26, about women who saw the trap too late, who understood the mechanics of their own destruction with perfect clarity and still couldn't stop the fall. She wasn't 26 anymore. She wasn't falling anymore. She was calculating. "Tell me where to go," she said. Outside, the city lights stretched on forever, and somewhere 43 floors below, the night doorman stood at his post, and the town car idled at a curb, and the machinery of Grant Holloway's world turned on its ordinary axis, completely unaware that the most essential thing inside it had just made a decision. She had 40 minutes before the driver returned. She needed 30. She had 30 minutes, and she used 28 of them. The bag she packed was small, a carry-on, black, the kind that didn't announce itself. She moved through the penthouse with the focused quiet of someone who had rehearsed this without knowing they were rehearsing it, pulling things from drawers and closets with a precision that surprised her. Passport. The external hard drive where she'd backed up the photographs from her phone. 3 changes of clothes, practical, nothing Grant had chosen for her. The small jewelry box from the back of the closet shelf. Not the pieces he'd given her, not the diamonds and the statements, but the things she'd owned before him. Her mother's watch, a ring from her sister, the things that still belonged to her. She left her wedding ring on the kitchen counter. She didn't place it carefully. She just set it down and walked away and didn't look back at it. And that small act of not looking was the most deliberate thing she'd done in 3 years. The elevator took 40 seconds. The lobby doorman, Miguel, who had worked nights in this building for 11 years, and who had once, 6 months ago, caught her eye in a way that told her he understood more than he would ever say, looked up from his desk when she came through with the bag, and something passed between them, brief and wordless, and he said, "Good night, Mrs. Holloway," and looked back down at his desk. Outside, a car was waiting, black, unremarkable, not a town car. The driver didn't introduce himself. He just said, "Ms. Voss," using her name, her actual name, the one she'd been erasing for 3 years, and opened the door, and she got in. And the city moved past the windows, and she didn't feel what she expected to feel. She'd expected terror. She'd been living next to terror for so long it had become architectural, load-bearing, part of the structure of her daily existence. Instead, she felt something closer to the feeling of stepping off a very high diving board, the suspended moment between leaving and landing, when the decision has already been made and the body is simply catching up with it. Her phone was in her bag. She didn't look at it. Somewhere in Midtown, Grant Holloway was having dinner with men who needed something from him, performing the version of himself that the world saw. Expansive, commanding, the architect of a self-made empire. And he didn't yet know that the woman he'd been slowly dismantling had just walked out of his building with a carry-on bag and her mother's watch and 37 photographs of his financial documents. He was going to find out. That was the part she couldn't think about yet. The car crossed the bridge into Brooklyn, and the city changed character the way it always did. Lower, less vertical, more lived in, the kind of streets that didn't exist to impress anyone. And eventually stopped in front of a townhouse on a tree-lined block in Brooklyn Heights that was dark and expensive and completely unremarkable from the outside, which she suspected was the point. Damien Vale opened the door before she knocked. He was in a dark sweater and dark pants, no jacket. The formal architecture of the gala dissolved entirely, and he looked different in this context. Not smaller, but more actual, the way people always looked when you encountered them in spaces they actually inhabited. He looked at the bag she was carrying and then at her face and said nothing, which was the right thing. She didn't need commentary on what she'd just done. She just needed somewhere to put it down. "3rd floor," he said, and stepped back to let her in. "There's a room at the end of the hall, bathrooms en suite. Take whatever time you need." She went upstairs. She didn't look at much. The house registered as warm, ordered, the kind of space that had been designed by someone who understood silence rather than noise, and found the room at the end of the hall, which had a window that looked out over the back garden and a bed with clean white sheets and a lamp that was already on, as if someone had anticipated her arrival and wanted her to feel like less of a fugitive. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and stayed that way for a while. Not crying, just being still in a way she hadn't been still in 3 years. Then she washed her face and went back downstairs. He was in the kitchen. There was coffee, which she didn't need but took anyway, because the ritual of it was grounding. He sat across from her at a kitchen table that was old and heavy and real, the kind of furniture that had been somewhere for decades, and he had a folder open in front of him that he closed when she sat down. "You want to know why I did this?" he said. "I want to know what you expect in return." He looked at her steadily. "Nothing. That's not an answer. That's what people say before they explain what the answer actually is." Something moved in his expression. Not amusement, not quite. The closest thing to it. "Fair," he said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug, and she noticed his hands for the first time, large, scarred across the knuckles on the right, in a way that didn't match a man who'd made his money behind a desk. "My mother was married to a man like Grant Holloway. Different industry, same architecture. I was 12 when it ended. It didn't end well." She waited. She didn't have anyone who'd looked into him beforehand, who knew what was coming, who had... He stopped. Set the mug down. "I have resources. I have a legal team that doesn't need to be briefed because they've been briefed for 6 months. I have specific reasons to want Grant Holloway's operations examined very carefully by people whose job it is to examine them." He looked at her directly. "And I saw what happened at that table, at the gala. So this is personal and professional." Yes, she appreciated that. The cleanness of it. She was so tired of things being obscured. "Tell me about the legal situation," she said. "Vivian Cross said he'll freeze everything." "He'll try. We file first tomorrow morning. Vivian's already been briefed. She knows what documentation you have and how to deploy it." He reached for the folder and opened it again, turning it so she could see. Grant's Long Island City development has 3 separate financing structures that don't survive scrutiny. There are investors who are given projections that don't match the actual permit applications. There are zoning variances that were obtained through payments to 2 city officials who are currently very interested in protecting themselves. He paused. When that becomes public, and it will become public, his capacity to mount a sustained legal campaign against a divorce gets significantly complicated. Elara looked at the documents in the folder. Numbers, dates, names she recognized and names she didn't. The papery scaffolding of her husband's empire, which she now understood was never as solid as it appeared. "He's going to say I'm with you," she said, romantically. "He's going to use that." "Yes." "Is that going to be a problem?" Damien looked at her without expression. "People have said worse things about me." She almost laughed. It surprised her. The almost laugh. The fact that her body still contained it somewhere, buried under everything else. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be long." She nodded and stood. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. "Damien." She said the name deliberately, the way Vivian Cross had said hers, like an anchor. "Thank you." He didn't tell her it was nothing. He just nodded, once, and looked back at the folder, and she went upstairs and lay down in the room with the lit lamp and the garden window, and she slept, actually slept for the first time in longer than she could remember, until the morning came gray and cold through the glass, and everything she'd done was still real, which was both terrifying and quietly miraculous. Grant found out at 7:43 in the morning. She knew the precise time because she was sitting in Vivian Cross's office when Vivian's assistant knocked and said her husband had called the office line 3 times in the last 20 minutes. And Vivian had looked at Elara and said, "He knows." And Elara had felt her stomach drop through the floor and said, "Yes." The filing had gone in at 7:15. Vivian set her phone face down on the desk. "He's going to call you next." "I know." Let it go to voicemail. The first 24 hours are critical. We control the documentation timeline. We control the communication. Anything you say to him directly becomes part of the record, and right now the record is completely on your side. Elara's phone buzzed. Grant's name on the screen. She watched it buzz and looked at Vivian and let it go. Voicemail. 3 seconds of silence, and then his voice. Not the public voice, not the polished one, but something compressed and cold and very controlled. "Call me back, Elara. Whatever you think you're doing, you need to stop and call me back. This is not..." A pause. "This is a mistake you don't understand yet. Call me back." Vivian listened to the playback with her eyes on the desk. Then she said, "Good, keep all of them." By 9 a.m., Grant had retained 2 attorneys. Vivian had anticipated the names. By 11, he'd filed an emergency motion contesting the jurisdiction on the grounds that the marriage's primary domicile should be classified differently based on a property holding in New Jersey. Vivian had anticipated that too. At 12:30, she took a call, and her expression during it didn't change. But when she put the phone down, she looked at Alara with something that might have been the closest Vivian Cross came to looking shaken. "He's going to claim that you took documents from the marital home," Vivian said. "Privileged financial documents." "They weren't privileged. They were on his desk. He'll argue otherwise. He's also—" She picked up the pen, set it down again. "He's already called 3 journalists. Social pages, financial press. He's putting out a version of events involving you and Damien Vale that is going to make the next few weeks uncomfortable." "How uncomfortable?" "The kind where I strongly recommend you don't read anything published about yourself for a while." Alara sat with that. How many times has he done this before? The whole process, the marriage, the control, I can't discuss other clients. You said she settled. The woman before me. Vivian met her eyes. She did. Why? A long pause. Because she was alone, and he wasn't. Vivian picked up the pen again. You're not alone. That changes the arithmetic significantly. Ashim. She was not alone technically, but she felt it anyway. The acute specific loneliness of someone whose life had just been dismantled in public, which was different from ordinary loneliness the way surgery was different from a cut. She felt it in Damien's townhouse that evening, sitting at the heavy kitchen table with her laptop open, watching the first of the articles load. She told herself not to look. She looked anyway. The headline was from a gossip column she'd have previously dismissed as irrelevant. It was not irrelevant when it was about her. It described her as a socialite wife who had fled her marriage under suspicious circumstances to shelter with billionaire rival Damien Vale, with whom sources close to Grant Holloway claim she has maintained an inappropriate relationship for months. There was a photograph, taken at the gala at some angle she couldn't identify, slightly blurred, that showed her and Damien on the terrace. 20 words exchanged, the cold October night. A card set on a stone railing. It looked like what Grant intended it to look like. She closed the laptop. Her hands were steady. She was very focused on making her hands steady. Damien came into the kitchen and looked at her face and looked at the closed laptop. He didn't ask. He went to the refrigerator, took out something, and started doing something practical and quiet at the counter. Making food, she realized, which was such an unexpectedly human thing that it caught her off guard. I saw the article, she said. I've seen worse. About you specifically? About me, yes. He didn't turn around. I've been characterized as everything from a predatory developer to someone who has offshore accounts in 4 different countries, only 2 of which are accurate. Which 2? Now he turned, and there was the not quite amusement again, and she thought, this is a person who has decided what he will and won't allow to touch him, and he has held that line for a very long time, and it has cost him something she can't see yet. That's a second conversation, he said. She let that go. There was a plate in front of her suddenly. Pasta, simple, the kind of food that didn't require anything from you, and she ate it because she hadn't eaten since the previous night, and her body was now making that very clear, and they sat across from each other at the heavy table in a kitchen that smelled of garlic and olive oil, and the particular quality of a house that was inhabited by someone who actually lived in it rather than performing living. He called me 17 times today, she said. I know. I had someone monitoring for contact attempts. It's a security precaution. I should have told you. She looked at him, the monitoring, the legal team briefed for 6 months, the car that had been waiting when she came down. All of it assembled so quietly, so in advance, that she hadn't had to build anything from scratch. You planned for this, she said. For me, specifically. I planned for a possibility, he said carefully. I hoped you wouldn't need it. But you were ready. Yes. She sat with that. It should have felt invasive. She had the architecture of a feeling that it should have felt invasive. What it actually felt like was something she didn't have good language for. The feeling of having been seen from a distance by someone who then quietly built you a door. He's not going to stop, she said. No. The articles are going to get worse. Probably. And the legal process will be long. He met her eyes. I told you it wouldn't be clean. I know. She pushed the empty plate back slightly. I'm not looking for clean. I'm looking for out. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its evening rhythms. A dog barking 2 houses over, a car passing on the wet street. The ordinary sounds of a neighborhood that did not know or care that someone was sitting at a kitchen table reconstructing the terms of her life from scratch. She found the ordinariness of it grounding. She held on to it. Her phone buzzed. Not a call, a text. Unknown number, but the cadence of it was immediately recognizable. Do you understand what you've started? This does not end the way you think it ends. Come home. We can still fix this. She turned the phone face down. She photographed the message first, then turned it face down. He texted, she said. Damien held out his hand. She considered this for a moment, then slid the phone across the table. He looked at the message without expression, set the phone down and looked at her. He's scared, Damien said. Grant doesn't get scared. Everyone gets scared when they're losing control of something they believed was theirs. His voice was very level. That text is not from a man who has the situation handled. That's from a man who came home and found a wedding ring on a counter and realized he miscalculated. She looked at the phone between them on the table. What did he miscalculate? You, Damien said simply. She didn't say anything. The words sat there between them, too plain to deflect. Later, after she'd gone upstairs and he'd remained at the table with his folder and his coffee, and the particular focused stillness that seemed to be his natural state, she lay in the room with the garden window and listened to Brooklyn being ordinary outside, and thought about what it meant to have been miscalculated. By Grant, who had looked at her and seen only what he intended to make of her. And by herself, perhaps. In the years before she understood that what she'd been doing was not surviving, but disappearing. The thought that followed was the one she'd been keeping at a distance, the one with real weight to it. Grant was scared. Scared men with resources and no conscience and everything to lose were not less dangerous. They were more. She knew this. She'd known it in Vivian's office. She'd known it reading the text. She hadn't let herself feel the full shape of it until now, alone in the dark with the lamp off and the garden sounds outside. Because the full shape of it was this. She had started something that was going to require her to be very strong for a very long time. And she wasn't certain yet whether she was that strong, and she couldn't afford not to be. The business dinner was 11 days later, and she hadn't been intended to attend. It was a private event, 12 people, a restaurant in the West Village that did this kind of thing, rooms available for the particular kind of meal that was really a negotiation with better food. Damien had a standing conflict with 2 of the other attendees over a development project in Lower Manhattan, and his presence there was professional, and hers was not required. She came because Vivian called her at 4 in the afternoon and said, with the careful neutrality that Vivian used when the news was bad, Grant is going to be there. At Damien's dinner. He was invited by Marcus Hale, separately. It's possible Hale doesn't know about the conflict, or a pause. Or it's deliberate. It's deliberate, Ilara said. He's going to try to find out what we know. Yes, and without knowing what's said in that room, I'll be there, Ilara said. Vivian had told her not to. Damien, when she told him, had looked at her for a long moment with his hands flat on his desk and said, You understand what he's going to do when he sees you there. He's going to perform in front of those people. He's going to try to make me look like the problem. Yes. So I need to be there. Because I'm not the problem, and the people in that room need to see that. Another long pause. Then, wear something you feel like yourself in, not something you'd have worn for him. She owned almost nothing that hadn't been chosen by or for Grant. She borrowed a blazer from the woman who came 3 times a week to manage Damien's household, a woman named Rosaria, who was about her size, and who had, without being asked, begun including Ilara in the domestic routines of the house in a way that felt less like charity and more like matter-of-fact inclusion. The blazer was dark green. It didn't fit exactly right. She wore it anyway. She saw Grant before he saw her. He was at the far end of the private room talking to Marcus Hale with the ease of someone who believed the evening was already his, and he was wearing the campaign poster face, the wide jaw assurance, and he held a glass of red wine with the particular looseness of a man who had already had one glass somewhere else. She tracked him from across the room the way you tracked weather. Not with fear exactly, or not only fear, but with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read conditions. Then he turned and saw her. The face didn't change. That was the thing about Grant. The face never changed in public. It was too well trained, but she'd spent 3 years reading what happened underneath the face, the micro-tightening around the eyes, the jaw doing something almost invisible, and she watched it happen now from 12 feet away and felt something in her own chest settle into a cold, clear readiness. He excused himself from Hale and crossed the room toward her with a smile that was perfect and a pace that was unhurried, and that she knew from long experience communicated danger to no one in the room except her. "Elara," he said it warmly, almost tender. "I didn't know you'd be here." "Here I am." He positioned himself so she was slightly angled away from the room, a small territorial geometry she recognized. "We should talk. I think everything that needs to be said is being said through our attorneys." "Our attorneys." His voice was the soft one, the indoor voice he used right before things broke. "You have an attorney. I have a team of attorneys who are going to spend the next 18 months making your life—" "Grant!" She said his name the way you'd say stop. "I'm going to need you to not do this here. You came to my— This isn't yours." Something in her voice was different. She could hear it herself, steadier than it should have been, quieter in a way that was not deference but something else. "You were invited by Marcus Hale. I'm here with Damien Vale, whose event this actually is. You don't own this room." Something shifted behind his eyes. "You're going to regret— You've been saying that for 11 days. She held his gaze. Her hands were at her sides. "I'm still here." And then Damien was there, not rushing, not performing rescue, just arriving with the natural authority of someone in his own space, placing himself in the geometry of the conversation with a glass of water and a completely neutral expression that somehow communicated a complete wall. "Holloway," he said, "this is a working dinner. I'd appreciate it if you kept your private business out of my event." Grant looked at him. The smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. The structural integrity of the performance showing a crack along an old fault line. "Vale," he said, "I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss. Professionally." "I'm sure," Damien said, and looked away from Grant with the particular dismissal of someone who had already decided what another person was worth, and Grant was left standing there with his perfect jaw and his campaign smile and his wine glass, suddenly, visibly, reduced. She watched him feel it. She watched the room unconsciously reorient around the shift in gravity. She watched him recalculate rapidly and arrive at something she could see forming behind his eyes. Not retreat, Grant never retreated, but the kind of tactical reposition that was more dangerous than confrontation. He went back to Marcus Hale. He spent the rest of the dinner being charming and attentive and utterly self-contained. She watched him from across the table through the main course and the entree and the particular theater of a business dinner in New York, and she ate what was in front of her and said the things required of her and felt the cold, clear readiness in her chest stay steady. Afterward, in the car going back to Brooklyn, she didn't speak for a while. Damien didn't either. Then she said, "He's planning something." "Yes. You saw it too." "I saw it." He was looking out his window at the city. "He's going to move on the financial documents, try to get a court order before we can enter them as evidence. He must have found out—" He stopped, turned to look at her. "Someone in Vivian's office." The word landed in the car like something with weight. She thought about these documents, 2 years of photographs, sitting in a cloud account, now in the hands of Vivian's legal team. She thought about the speed with which Grant had known to file the specific motion about jurisdiction, the very thing Vivian had been prepared to counter, but had said the timing on was tight. She thought about the 17 phone calls on day 1. He'd known exactly what to do, immediately, as if he'd been told what was coming. Someone in Vivian's office. "We need to move the documents," she said. "Tonight," he agreed. "And we need to tell Vivian—" "Carefully." "Yes." She looked out her own window. Brooklyn was getting closer. "How long does this get worse before it gets better?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality it did when he was being completely honest rather than reassuring, which she'd learned to recognize and to prefer, even when what came out of it was hard. "It gets worse first," he said. "That's not something I can change." She nodded. Outside, the bridge cables went past the window in their long, anchored arcs, and below them the water was dark and cold and moving, and she thought about what Vivian had said. "You're not alone." That changes the arithmetic significantly. She was not alone. That was real. But what Grant was planning, whatever tactical thing had been forming behind his eyes across that dinner table, was also real and was coming faster than she'd calculated. And when it arrived, there would be no neutral ground left, no half measures, no version of this that didn't require her to be exactly as strong as she wasn't sure she could. The documents were gone by midnight, not moved, not misfiled, gone. The cloud account emptied with the kind of surgical precision that didn't happen by accident, the folder structure intact but hollow. Every photograph she'd taken over 2 years of careful, terrified documentation reduced to a series of empty directories with timestamps that stopped at 11:47 p.m., which was 17 minutes after she and Damien had crossed the bridge back into Brooklyn and understood what was coming. Whoever had done it had been fast. Whoever had done it had known exactly where to look. She sat in Damien's study at 1 in the morning with her laptop open and the screen showing her the emptied account, and felt something she hadn't felt since the night she left the penthouse. The specific quality of helplessness that was different from fear, colder than fear. The feeling of a floor giving way underfoot in a place you'd believed was solid. Damien stood behind her looking at the screen. He didn't say anything for a long time. "The backup," she said. "The external drive." "Where is it?" "Vivian's office safe. I gave it to her 3 days ago." He moved to the desk, picked up his phone, and called. It rang 7 times. Voicemail. He called again. On the 3rd attempt, Vivian picked up, her voice thick with sleep, and he told her in 4 sentences what had happened and asked about the drive. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds too long. "Vivian," he said. "The safe was accessed this afternoon," she said, "by someone with the combination. I don't—" Her voice had a quality Alara had never heard in it before, so stripped of its professional composure, raw at the edges. "I need to call you back." She didn't call back. She arrived. 40 minutes later, Vivian Cross was sitting at Damien's kitchen table in a coat she hadn't bothered to button, her gray hair uncombed with the face of someone who had been moving through a bad dream and had just reached the part where the dream became real. She had the external drive in a plastic evidence bag. She set it on the table between them. "The drive is intact," she said. "I got there before—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I got there in time." "Who had the combination?" Damien said. Vivian looked at the table. "In my office, 4 people have access to that safe. Myself, my senior partner, my paralegal coordinator." She paused. "And my associate, James Whitfield, who has been with the firm for 3 years and who I trusted completely, and who, I've now confirmed, has been receiving payments from a holding company that traces back, very indirectly, to a development LLC with Grant Holloway's fingerprints on its founding documents." The kitchen was very quiet. Alara looked at the drive in its plastic bag and thought about 2 years. 2 years of waking up in the morning and going to sleep at night inside a life that was methodically destroying her, and finding, in the margins of that life, the small acts of resistance, the phone positioned carefully, the documents photographed with hands that had learned to stop shaking, the cloud account opened on a phone in a coffee shop on Lexington with the collar of her coat turned up. 2 years of accumulation. Now in a plastic bag on someone else's table because she had trusted the wrong institution. "He knew the whole time," she said. Her voice came out flat. "From the beginning. Whitfield was already there when I called Vivian." Vivian looked at her. "I don't know when the arrangement started. I'm going to find out." "It doesn't matter when it started." Alara stood up. The chair scraped back and she didn't care about the sound. She walked to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the garden, which was dark and wet, autumn finishing off the last of what had been growing there. "He knew I was building a case. He let me build it. He let me think I had leverage, and he—" She stopped. Her hands were on the windowsill and she was gripping it. "He was going to wait until we filed everything, until we committed fully to the evidentiary strategy, and then take it all. At the worst possible moment, when we couldn't rebuild in time. That's what the motion was, Damien said from behind her. The jurisdiction filing. It wasn't about jurisdiction, it was misdirection. Something to keep Vivian's team focused on countering while Whitfield found the right moment. How long did you need the documents for the case? She asked Vivian. Vivian was quiet for a moment. The court date for the asset freeze is in 9 days. Can we rebuild the documentation in 9 days? A longer pause. Some of it, not all. The photographs were the cleanest evidence, direct images of the documents in situ, with timestamps establishing your access to them during the marriage. Without them, we're working from the documents themselves, which his team will argue were obtained. I know what they'll argue. Alara turned from the window. Her face felt very still, the way faces went still when the body was managing something the mind hadn't caught up to yet. What can we prove without the photographs? Vivian met her eyes. Less. Not nothing, but less. Then we need something else. She looked at Damien. The city officials. The zoning variances. You said 2 officials were paid. Yes. They're protecting themselves. You said that they're interested in protecting themselves. That means they're scared. That means they're potentially willing to, potentially, he said, getting them to speak on record in 9 days. What about the investors, the ones who got false projections? Damien looked at her with something shifting in his expression. Not surprise exactly. The expression of someone who had anticipated a particular version of a conversation and was now encountering a different one. 2 of them have already been in contact with my attorney, he said. Informally, they're not ready to go on record. Then we make them ready. She pulled out the chair she'd vacated and sat back down. Her hands were flat on the table. Show me everything you have. Not the summary. Everything. Vivian and Damien exchanged a look. It was brief, and she caught it, and she understood what it communicated. An acknowledgement between 2 people who had been operating carefully on her behalf, that the person they'd been operating on behalf of had just stopped being a subject and become something else. All right, Damien said. Tick. They worked until 4 in the morning. By the time Vivian left, her coat finally buttoned, her expression reconstituted into something approaching its professional shape. They had a partial map of what remained and what could be rebuilt, and what required people who were currently unwilling to cooperate to become willing in the next 9 days. It was not a strong position. Alara had looked at enough of Grant's documents over enough years to understand leverage and timeline and the specific mathematics of institutional pressure, and what she was looking at was not strong. It was possible. It was not strong. She was still at the kitchen table when the sky outside started going gray. Damien came back from walking Vivian out and stopped in the doorway and looked at her sitting among the papers and the cold coffee and said nothing for a moment. You should sleep, he said finally. In a minute. She looked up. The woman before me, the one who settled. She'd been thinking about her for an hour. Do you know her name? He sat down across from her. Sonia Dravant. She's in Seattle now. Remarried. Does she know what I'm doing? He was quiet for a moment. She knows a case is being built. Vivian reached out 6 months ago. She declined to participate. She's scared. She signed an NDA with teeth, and yes, she's scared. If I reach out to her directly, the NDA prohibits her from discussing the settlement. It doesn't prohibit her from describing her own experience of the marriage. Alara looked at him steadily. I know exactly what those NDAs say. I've been looking at Grant's legal architecture for 2 years. He uses the same firm every time. The language is specific to financial disclosure. It doesn't cover testimony about conduct. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You'd have to convince her. In 9 days. I know. If she says no, then she says no. Alara pushed back from the table slightly. But she might not say no. Because she spent years building something inside a marriage that was dismantling her, the same way I did, and she settled because she was alone and he wasn't, and now she's in Seattle and she's remarried and maybe she's fine, or maybe she wakes up at 3 in the morning thinking about what she didn't do when she had the chance. The kitchen was very quiet. I wake up thinking about that, she said, about the 2 years I documented instead of left, about every calculation I made and every day I stayed and every time I told myself it wasn't bad enough yet. Her voice hadn't risen. It remained very level, very controlled, but the thing underneath it was not controlled. I'm not doing it again. I'm not losing this because a man I trusted for years had someone in Vivian's office and got there first. I am not. She stopped, pressed her thumb hard against the edge of the table, and breathed. I need Sonia Dravant's number. Damien reached for his phone. Sags. Sonia answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been told to expect a call, which meant Damien had texted ahead in the 20 seconds between handing Alara the number and sitting back in his chair with his arms crossed and his eyes on the garden window. Alara noted this and filed it and felt something she didn't have time to examine. I know why you're calling, Sonia said. Her voice was low and careful and Pacific Northwestern, in a way that had nothing to do with geography. It was the voice of someone who had been careful for a long time and had made a practice of it. I can't help you. You mean you don't want to? A pause. I mean what I said. Sonia. Alara looked at the table. He had someone in my attorney's office. They cleared my documentation last night. 2 years of evidence. In 9 days, I go in front of a judge without the evidentiary foundation my case was built on, and he walks away from this the same way he walked away from your settlement. Intact and ready to do it again. Silence. I'm not asking you to violate your NDA. I'm not asking about money or terms. I'm asking you to describe what you lived. That's exactly what I can't. The NDA covers financial disclosure. I've read the template. His firm uses the same language every time. A longer silence. She heard Sonia breathing on the other end. Careful, measured, the breathing of someone managing something large. I have a daughter, Sonia said finally. She's 4. I have a husband who doesn't know everything. I have a life I built very carefully on top of something I never want to think about again. I know. No. The word was quiet but final. You don't. Not yet. You're still in the middle of it. You don't know what the after is like, what it costs to make the after work. Another breath. And if I do what you're asking and he finds a way to use it, I won't let that happen. You can't promise me that. You don't control what he does. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Brooklyn was beginning its morning sounds. The first garbage truck somewhere distant, a car starting, the city remembering what it was. No, Alara said. I can't promise you that. I can't control him. I couldn't control him when I was living inside his life, and I can't control him now. She paused. But I can tell you that the woman who comes after you, after me, doesn't get a Vivian Cross. She doesn't get 9 days and a legal team and someone who noticed what was happening on a terrace. She gets what you got, alone. And she makes the calculation you made, and she signs. And she goes to Seattle. And she builds something on top of something she can never talk about, and he does it again. The silence on the line went on long enough that she thought Sonia had disconnected. Then, I'll call you back. The line went dead. Alara set the phone down on the table. Damien was looking at her. She met his eyes and held them, and what was passing between them was something she didn't have language for yet. Not comfort, not reassurance, but the particular recognition between two people who understood what it was to hold a thing under pressure and refuse to let it break. She'll call back, Alara said. I think so too. Sonia called back at 7:41 a.m. She spoke for 38 minutes without stopping. She described a marriage with the specific, granular clarity of someone who had stored every detail in a place they'd been trying not to access. And now that the door was open, everything came out with the terrible momentum of something that had been compressed for too long. She described the progression, the early control framed as protection, the isolation that arrived gradually and always had a reasonable explanation, the financial architecture that dismantled her independence piece by piece while presenting itself as partnership. She described the night she understood it had become something other than what she'd been telling herself it was. She didn't cry. Her voice stayed level the whole time. That was the part that was hardest to listen to. Vivian's team had someone on the call. Everything was recorded with Sonia's consent. At 7:42 the following morning, Grant's legal team filed an emergency injunction. It arrived at Vivian's office at 8:15, and Vivian called Alara at 8:20 with a voice that was doing the work of staying composed and not quite succeeding. And Alara listened to the terms of the injunction and sat down on the edge of the bed in the room with the garden window and stared at the far wall. The injunction cited the documents, not the photographs. Those were gone. The documents themselves, the originals, which Grant was claiming she had physically removed from the marital home on the night she left. His team had filed an affidavit asserting that specific financial records pertaining to ongoing business operations had been taken without authorization, constituting potential criminal conduct. The injunction was seeking to have her held in contempt, to freeze the dissolution proceedings entirely, and to compel her to return all materials. The criminal conduct designation. Alara, Vivian said. I didn't take any physical documents, she said. Her voice was very steady. I took photographs, on my phone, of documents that were accessible to me as his spouse in our marital home. I know that. Can you prove it? A pause. Your phone's metadata. He'll argue the metadata was manipulated. The timestamps, Vivian, she stopped, made herself breathe. He put someone in your office. He moved on the cloud account within minutes of us identifying the breach. He has been planning this exact sequence, probably since before I called you the first time. If he's filing criminal language, she pressed her hand flat against her sternum. He's not trying to win the divorce. He's trying to bury the case so deep I can't dig out. The silence from Vivian was its own answer. She sat there with the phone against her ear and felt the shape of what Grant had built against her. Not a legal maneuver, not even a counterattack. An architecture. Patient, layered, assembled over months, designed to collapse around her at the exact moment when she'd committed fully and had the least ability to recover. Designed by someone who understood her well enough to know when she would move and what she would use and how to take it. She'd spent 3 years thinking she was the one paying careful attention. She hadn't been paying careful enough attention. Downstairs, she heard Damien's voice. He was on his own phone, already moving, the controlled velocity of someone who had anticipated contingencies even for the contingencies. She heard her own name once, clipped, and then numbers, and then a name she didn't recognize. She ended the call with Vivian and sat for another moment alone. The thing rising in her was not the cold, clear readiness of the night she'd left. That had been a decision. What was rising now was different, uglier, less clean. The thing that came when a decision turned out to be more expensive than calculated. When the floor you'd stepped onto revealed itself as something that had been arranged to give way. It was grief and fury and a particular shame that she identified after a moment as the shame of having underestimated him, of having believed, somewhere underneath the strategy and the documentation and the escape plan, that he would not go this far. She'd known better. She'd been living with what he was for 3 years. She'd known better than to underestimate him. And she had done it anyway, because you couldn't live inside the full knowledge of what he was every moment of every day without that knowledge eventually becoming unbearable. So you calibrated it down, you managed the dose, you let yourself believe sometimes that you saw the whole shape of it. You didn't see the whole shape of it. You never did. That was the thing about people like Grant Holloway. The whole shape was always larger than what was visible, and by the time you saw it completely, you were already inside it. She stood up. She went downstairs. Damien was in the study, still on his phone, and when he saw her face, he ended the call mid-sentence, just said, "I'll call you back," and put the phone down. "Tell me where we actually are," she said. "Not the managed version, not the version designed to keep me functional, where we actually are." He looked at her for a long moment, then he sat back in his chair and told her. The injunction would be heard in 6 days, 3 days before the original asset freeze hearing, meaning the asset freeze hearing was now irrelevant unless the injunction was defeated first. To defeat the injunction, they needed to demonstrate that the documents she'd photographed were legitimately accessible to her as a marital spouse, that no criminal conduct had occurred, and that the claim was being filed in bad faith as a litigation tactic. Bad faith required showing pattern and intent. Showing pattern required corroboration. Sonia Dravant's testimony was corroboration of conduct, but not of legal strategy. They needed someone inside Grant's operation, or inside his legal infrastructure, who could speak to the deliberate construction of the Whitfield arrangement. Whitfield himself, she said. He's retained his own attorney. He's not talking. What did they offer him? We don't know yet. He's going to take whatever they offered and stay quiet and let them burn him if they need to, because that's how Grant works. He protects people who are useful and disposes of people who aren't. And right now, Whitfield is useful. She sat down in the chair across from the desk. Who in Grant's legal team has exposure they didn't anticipate? Damien was quiet for a moment. Why? Because the Whitfield arrangement didn't happen without someone in Grant's firm signing off on the payments. The holding company that paid Whitfield, someone documented that. Someone authorized those transfers. And if Grant is willing to expose Whitfield to protect himself, whoever authorized those payments is now thinking very carefully about whether they're next. The study was quiet. She heard the house around them. Rosaria's footsteps somewhere on the floor above. The refrigerator's hum from the kitchen. The ambient sound of a building that continued to exist around the emergency of her situation with complete indifference. Damien picked up his phone. Set it back down. Looked at her. There's something else, he said. Something I've been trying to find the right moment for, and there is no right moment, so. She felt the quality of the air in the room change. The development LLC that paid Whitfield, he said. When my team traced it last night, he paused. His hands were flat on the desk. It's not the first time that LLC was used to manage a sensitive payment situation. We found 2 other instances. One was a building inspector in Queens 18 months ago. The other, he looked at her directly. The other was a payment to a man named Carter Briggs 6 years ago, before you married Grant. She didn't know the name. She said so. Carter Briggs was a journalist, Damien said. He was working on an investigation into early irregularities in Grant's first major development deal. The investigation was never published. Briggs left the paper. He's been doing freelance work since, mostly not real estate. She looked at him. He was paid to kill the story, or threatened, or both. Damien's voice was very level. The point is the LLC. It has a pattern. It's been used at least 3 times to manage problems that Grant needed to make disappear quietly. If we can establish the pattern, it becomes evidence of a systematic strategy, bad faith across multiple instances. She was already seeing it. That's what defeats the injunction. Potentially. If we can document the other 2 payments completely enough in 6 days. Carter Briggs, she said. Where is he? Brooklyn, Damien said. As it happens. She looked at him. Something in the way he said it. You already know which neighborhood. I know his address, he said. I've been sitting on it for a week because I wasn't sure whether bringing it to you would help or... Why wouldn't it help? He was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide something. Because when I found Carter Briggs, I also found what the story was. The one Grant paid to kill. He met her eyes and held them. It wasn't just development irregularities, Alara. The story was about a woman who worked for Grant's company in 2017 who was injured on a site that Grant had ordered to open before safety inspections were complete. She was hurt seriously. The story was going to name Grant specifically as having overridden the inspection certification. He paused. The woman's settlement, separate from Briggs's payment, came from the same LLC. The room went very still. Her name, Alara said. Maya Wren. Is she willing to talk? Another pause. Longer. The quality of the pause telling her something she wasn't going to like. She died in 2021, Damien said quietly. Unrelated causes. She's not going to talk. The floor gave way again. Just slightly. Just enough. She sat in the study of Damien Vale's Brooklyn townhouse in the early morning light, with 6 days until a hearing that could bury her case, with a dead woman's name between her and the man who had dismantled her life, with the full shape of Grant Holloway finally, visible in its entirety, and what she felt was not grief and not fury and not the cold, clear readiness she'd felt before. What she felt was the particular vertiginous recognition of someone who understood for the first time that the man she'd married was not a difficult man or a controlling man or a man with a pattern of behavior she could document and litigate and escape. He was something worse. He had always been something worse, and she had been inside it, adjacent to it, sleeping next to it, eating at the same table as it. And she was only alive right now because he had decided it was more useful to dismantle her slowly than to do something faster, and that calculation had held precisely as long as she wasn't a threat, and now she was a threat. and the injunction with its criminal language was not a legal maneuver. It was a message. She looked at Damien. He was watching her with the stillness he always had, the contained quality. But underneath it, she could see something she hadn't seen there before. Something careful and worried and close to. She said, "Tell me the rest." Damien looked at her across the desk, and she watched him make the decision. The small, muscular event around his jaw, the intake of breath that didn't quite complete itself. And then he told her. Carter Briggs was 53 years old and lived in a walk-up in Carroll Gardens and had been drinking steadily since 2019, which was 2 years after Grant's people had come to see him and explained, in terms that didn't require elaboration, what would happen to his career and possibly his person if the story ran. He'd killed it. He told his editor it didn't hold up. He'd left the paper 8 months later and hadn't done anything serious since. Local interest pieces, a real estate newsletter, the diminished output of a man who had made one defining compromise and was living inside its aftermath. Damien had a contact who knew him, had known him, past tense, from a different time. The contact said Briggs still had the notes. "How confident?" Alara said. 60%. That he has them, or that he'll use them? That he has them. Damien's voice was flat. Whether he'll use them is a different question. He's been sitting on this for 7 years. He made his deal, and he's been living with it, and he has reasons to stay where he is. Fear. And something worse than fear, he thinks it wouldn't matter. He thinks Grant is too embedded, too protected, that bringing the story now, what's left of it, without Maya Wren, would just get him destroyed without actually doing anything. She stood up. The chair moved back, and she was on her feet before she'd decided to be, the body making the decision first the way it did when the mind was too slow. "When can we see him?" Alara said, "Today." "When can we see him today?" Damien looked at her for a moment. He picked up his phone. Carroll Gardens at 9 in the morning was corner stores and school run and the specific unhurried rhythms of a neighborhood that had been something before money found it and was negotiating daily what it was going to be now. Carter Briggs lived on the 3rd floor of a building on a tree-lined block where the trees were old enough to have opinions, their roots buckling the sidewalk in long, slow assertions of precedence. He opened the door on the second knock and looked at them both, and then looked specifically at Damien and said, "I told Marcus not to give you my address." "Marcus didn't," Damien said. "Can we come in?" Briggs was a tall man gone to softness, the structure of what he'd been still visible underneath what the years had done to it. Gray stubble, dark eyes that had been sharp once, and were now carefully unfocused, the way eyes went when their owner had made a practice of not looking at things too directly. He was in a flannel shirt and jeans, and his feet were bare, and there was coffee on the stove behind him that smelled burned. He looked at Alara. Something moved across his face. "You're Holloway's wife." "Not for much longer," she said. "Can we come in?" He stepped back. It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It was the movement of a man who was very tired and hadn't had enough resistance left for a firm refusal. The apartment was small and organized in the way of someone who spent a lot of time alone. Everything had a place, but the places were chosen for function rather than appearance. Books stacked on the floor where there was no shelf space, papers on the kitchen table held down by a coffee mug that left rings. A laptop open to nothing in particular. A window that looked out onto the brick wall of the next building. He didn't offer them anything. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his burned coffee behind him and looked at them the way people looked at things they'd decided not to get involved with. "I know why you're here," he said. "Then we can skip the introduction," Alara said. "You have notes from the 2017 investigation. We need them." "I don't have anything." "You have notes," Damien said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact delivered with the particular flatness that didn't leave room for a comfortable lie. You kept them because you knew you'd want them eventually, or because you couldn't make yourself destroy them. Either way, Briggs looked at the floor. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Even if I did, what you're describing, entering them into a legal proceeding, that's not journalism anymore. That's testimony. That's me standing up in front of a judge and saying I sat on a story because a man scared me into it, and then having Grant Holloway's legal team spend the next 3 years making sure I never work again." "You're not working now," Alara said. The words came out harder than she intended. She watched them land, watched Briggs' face do something complicated, the particular expression of someone who has been told a true thing they needed to not hear. "That wasn't fair," she said. "I'm sorry." "No." He shook his head slightly. "It's accurate." He unfolded his arms, put one hand on the kitchen doorframe. "Maya Wren is dead." "I know. She was 26 when it happened. She was a site coordinator and she went onto that floor because Grant's project manager told her the inspection had cleared and it hadn't, and the platform gave way." He said it with the particular flatness of someone who had rehearsed this in private many times, told it to no one, and was now finding that it came out with less force than he'd expected. She lost mobility in her left arm, permanently. She worked through 4 surgeries and a settlement that legally prevented her from discussing the circumstances, and she died of a cardiac event at 39 because the surgeries had complications that nobody adequately attributed to the original injury, but that I believe contributed. He stopped. "I believe that. I can't prove it." The apartment was very quiet. "I can't give her back what she lost," Ilara said. "I can't undo what happened to her." She held his gaze. "But I can make what happened to her mean something in a proceeding that is actively trying to bury the pattern. I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm asking you to give us what you have so that a judge in 6 days can see the full shape of who Grant Holloway is." Briggs looked at her for a long time. She could hear his breathing, slow, deliberate, the breathing of someone managing a decision that had weight. He went to the bedroom. She heard him moving, something being shifted, a drawer opening and closing. He came back with a hard drive. Old, small, the kind that was purchased in 2017 and had been sitting undisturbed since. He held it out. She took it. "I want a copy of whatever you file," he said. "Not for publication. I just want to know it was used." "You'll know," Damien said. Vivian Cross had 4 attorneys in her conference room when they arrived at 10:45. She looked at the hard drive and at Ilara's face and said, "Tell me." And Ilara told her, and the room went to work. They worked for 11 hours. By 6 p.m., they had a counterfiling that incorporated Carter Briggs's 2017 notes, the payment records from the LLC, the documentation of the Whitfield arrangement, and Sonia Drevant's recorded testimony, organized into an evidentiary structure that Vivian's senior partner described as, with the careful understatement of someone who had been doing this for 30 years, unusually comprehensive. The injunction hearing was in 5 days. The counterfiling needed to be received by the court by 9 a.m. the following morning. They filed at 8:57. At 9:31, Grant Holloway's lead attorney called Vivian's office. Vivian took it on speaker with Ilara in the room, which was the first time Ilara had heard the voice of the man who'd been orchestrating the legal assault against her. A voice that was smooth and measured and that went noticeably less smooth when Vivian outlined the content of the counterfiling. There was a pause after Vivian finished. Then the voice said, "We'll need time to review the new materials." "You have 4 days," Vivian said. "We'll see you in court." She ended the call and looked at Ilara and said, "He's going to try to settle." "No," Ilara said. "Ilara, no settlement, no NDA, no quiet resolution that lets him protect the narrative." She heard her own voice as if from a slight distance. Not raised, not uncontrolled, but with something in it that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago when she'd first sat in this office. Something that had been built, under pressure, out of materials she hadn't known she had. "I want this heard. I want a judge to see the LLC and Maya Wren and Carter Briggs and Sonia Drevant, and all of it on the record, in a public proceeding. That's the only version of this I'm accepting." Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and picked up her pen. The call came at 2 in the morning. Not Grant this time, a number she didn't recognize, and she almost didn't answer. And she answered. A man's voice. Young, tight, with something that wasn't quite fear but was adjacent to it. He said his name was Preston Lyle. He said he worked in the contracts division of Holloway Development. He said he had been the one who processed the payments through the LLC, all 3 instances, and that he had documentation of the authorizations, including the signature on the Maya Wren settlement and the email chain that preceded the Briggs payment, and that he had received, 3 hours ago, a phone call from Grant Holloway's personal attorney suggesting that his own legal exposure in the matter was significant. He said, I think they're going to make me the fall guy." She sat up in bed. Her heart was going very fast and she was very still, the way the body went still when it needed to function precisely. "Where are you right now?" "My apartment, Brooklyn." "Don't go anywhere. Don't call anyone. Give me your address." She was already out of bed. "I'm calling someone who is going to come to you tonight. You stay where you are." She had Damien's door open before he'd fully woken. He sat up and looked at her standing in his doorway with her phone in her hand and something in her face that made him go immediately, completely alert. "Preston Lyle," she said. "Holloway Development Contracts Division. He processed the LLC payments. He has the authorization chain, all of it. And Grant's people just told him he has exposure, which means they're moving to insulate Grant by making Lyle the responsible party, which means Lyle has exactly tonight to decide which side of this he's on before they get to him first." Damien was out of bed. "Address." She read it to him. He was already dressed. "I'm coming," she said. "Elara, I'm coming." He looked at her for 1 second, then, "Get your coat." Preston Lyle was 28 years old and looked younger, sitting at his kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a glass of water he wasn't drinking, in an apartment that had the specific disorder of someone who had been living at work for years and had never quite finished moving in. He looked at them both when they came through the door, and then he looked at Elara and said, "You're her." "I'm her," she said, and sat down across from him without being invited. "Show me what you have." He had a folder. Inside the folder were printed copies he'd made at the office 3 days ago. He said he'd felt it coming, had felt the shift in how people looked at him in the hallways, the meetings he was suddenly not included in after years of being the person who documented everything. He'd made copies because he'd learned, working for Grant Holloway, that documentation was the only currency that held its value. She went through the folder while Damien stood near the window, and Preston Lyle sat across from her and turned his water glass in slow circles on the table. The authorization chain was complete. Every payment, every signature, every email that preceded each transfer. Grant's signature on 2 of the 3 authorizations. The third bore the signature of his CFO, but there was an email above it, time-stamped, archived, in which Grant explicitly directed the payment with language that was careful but not careful enough. It was enough. She knew it was enough because her hands were very steady and her breathing was controlled, and she felt the thing in her chest that had been cold and clear since the night she left the penthouse expand into something with heat to it. "What do you need from me?" Preston Lyle said. "A sworn affidavit," she said, "tonight, and testimony at the hearing in 4 days." He looked at the table. His hands tightened on the glass. "They'll fire me." "You're already fired," Damien said from the window. "They just haven't told you yet." Preston looked at him. Damien's voice wasn't cruel. It was the voice of a man stating conditions. "You have 2 options," Elara said. "You let them make you the responsible party, and you spend the next several years explaining authorization chains you didn't design to regulators and possibly to prosecutors. Or you bring this to us tonight, you testify to what you witnessed and what you processed and who directed you, and you have the legal protection of being a cooperative witness in an active proceeding." She held his gaze. "I know which one I'd choose, but it has to be you." Preston Lyle looked at the folder. He looked at his water glass. He looked at the wall behind her, at something that wasn't there. Then he said, "Who do I call?" Vivian's associate met them at the office at 4 in the morning. Preston Lyle gave his affidavit in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and the particular quality of a space that had been occupied by high-stakes problem-solving for too many consecutive hours. He spoke for 2 hours. He was precise, thorough, and occasionally had to stop and press both hands flat on the conference table to steady himself, but he didn't stop and he didn't recant anything. At 6:30 a.m., the supplemental filing went to the court. At 7:15, Elara was back in Damien's kitchen with her shoes still on and her coat over the back of a chair, and Damien was making coffee that she actually needed now. And the gray light coming through the garden window had the particular quality of early morning in October in New York. Thin, cold, clarifying, the kind of light that didn't flatter anything but showed you what was actually there. She was very tired, the kind of tired that went past the body into something structural. Damien set a mug in front of her and sat down. He looked tired, too. Not defeated, never defeated with him, but the contained tension of someone who had been operating at full capacity for too many consecutive hours and was now simply continuing because stopping was not available as an option. 4 days, she said. 4 days. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The heat was almost painful, and she held it anyway. He's going to do something. Before the hearing, he's not going to just wait. No. What do you think he does? Damien was quiet for a moment. He's lost the legal strategy. He can't bury the documentation anymore. Too many copies, too many people who've seen it. He can't discredit Briggs without drawing more attention to the story. He can't neutralize Preston without it looking like witness tampering, which at this point he can't afford. He looked at his coffee, which means he does something personal. She felt it, the accuracy of it. She'd been with Grant Holloway for 3 years, and she knew how he operated when the professional options closed. He moved to the personal, to the terrain he understood best, the terrain of psychological pressure and targeted humiliation and the manipulation of the people around his target. He'd been doing it to her for 3 years in private. When the private options closed, he did it in public. The Meridian Foundation Gala, she said. Damien looked up. It's in 3 days. The annual one. We went last year and the year before. She met his eyes. He'll be there. He goes every year because Marcus Hale chairs it, and Marcus is still useful to him. And if he thinks I won't go, you want to go. I need to go. She set the mug down. 3 days before the hearing, in front of every person who saw what happened last year, I need to be there. Not hiding. Not in this house waiting for a court date. There. He looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet around them. You understand what he'll do? Yes. He'll use that room. He'll try to make it the story. The narrative of the wronged husband, the absent wife, let him. She felt it clearly, without heat, without the cold, clear quality of the night she left. Something steadier than both, something that had been built over the last 3 weeks from the specific materials of everything she'd survived and everything she'd made happen, and every phone call and every choice and every moment in which she'd been more than what Grant Holloway had decided she was. Let him walk into that room and perform in front of all those people who saw what he did to me last year, and let him look at me standing there, and let him say whatever he's going to say. And then, she picked up the mug again. And then I'll remind him where he made the mistake. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor as the sun got higher behind the clouds, and somewhere in Midtown, Grant Holloway was waking up in the penthouse that she had left 23 days ago with a carry-on bag and her mother's watch, and he was going to read the supplemental filing, and he was going to understand, for the first time fully, what she had become in the time since he'd miscalculated her. She had 4 days. The hearing had 4 days. The gala had 3. She drank her coffee and felt the heat of it go all the way down. And outside Brooklyn was waking up in its ordinary way. And in the conference room across the borough, Preston Lyle was finishing the last pages of his affidavit with hands that had stopped shaking. And in Carroll Gardens, Carter Briggs was probably sitting with his burned coffee looking at a hard drive that was no longer sitting in the back of a drawer. And Sonia Dravant was in Seattle with her 4-year-old daughter and her husband, who didn't know everything, and all of them were part of something that was 2 days away from either holding or breaking. She thought about the St. Regis ballroom, the chandeliers, the way 500 people had gone silent when a crystal glass hit the marble floor, and the way Grant's voice had filled that silence with something designed to reduce her, and the way she had walked out of that room and found a terrace and a cold night and a plain white card. She thought about what she was going to say to him when she walked back into that room. She already knew. She had known for a while, maybe since the kitchen at 2 in the morning with the wall against her back and the match catch in her chest. She just hadn't let herself rehearse it yet, because it required her to believe she was going to get there. And she was going to get there. And Grant Holloway was going to be standing in the St. Regis ballroom in 3 days with his campaign poster jaw and his winter sky eyes and his very carefully constructed version of events. And she was going to walk in wearing something that belonged to... She wore dark green, not the borrowed blazer. She'd given that back to Rosario with a gratitude that felt inadequate for what it had represented. This was something she'd bought herself 3 days ago in a store on Atlantic Avenue that had no connection to Grant, no history, nothing that carried his fingerprints. A deep green dress, simple lines, the kind of thing she would have chosen at 31 before she'd learned to dress for someone else's approval. It fit exactly right. She stood in the room with the garden window and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, not checking, not assessing through his eyes, just looking at her own face. She was 34 years old. There were things in her face that hadn't been there at 31. A quality around the eyes that wasn't quite hardness, not cynicism, but something earned and not returnable. The face of someone who had been inside something and come back from it carrying the knowledge of what it was. She didn't look diminished. She hadn't expected to, but she confirmed it now, and the confirmation mattered. Rosaria knocked and opened the door slightly. "The car is downstairs." "Thank you," Alara said. She picked up the small bag on the dresser, different from the one she'd packed 26 days ago, different in every way, belonging entirely to the person she was now. And she went downstairs. Damien was in the hallway, dark suit that contained authority he wore without apparent effort, and he looked at her when she came down, and something in his expression did what it always did when he was carefully not saying something. "You look like yourself," he said finally. It was exactly the right thing. She didn't tell him that. She just nodded, and he held the door open, and they went out into the Brooklyn night. The St. Regis ballroom was exactly as she remembered it. The chandeliers, the 40-foot ceilings, the 500 people in black tie moving through the space with the orchestrated confidence of the very wealthy, and the flower arrangements taller than children, and the marble floor where a crystal glass had detonated 1 year ago while she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and learned what kind of silence could be weaponized. She walked in beside Damien and felt the room register them. She recognized the quality of the attention, not the focused, murmuring attention of scandal, but something subtler, the adjusted awareness of people who had followed the headlines and the social page items and the competing narratives and were now recalibrating in real time. She let them look. She kept her chin level and her pace unhurried and her face composed in a way that was not performance. It was something else. The expression of a person who had been through the fire and knew what they'd found there. Marcus Hale intercepted them first, near the entrance. His expression, the diplomatic neutrality of a man who considered himself above the fray and was in fact deeply invested in it. He shook Damien's hand and nodded at Alara with the careful blankness of someone who'd decided to wait and see how the evening arranged itself before committing to a position. "Vale," he said, "I wasn't sure we'd see you." "Why not?" Damien said pleasantly. It was not a question. Hale's eyes moved to Alara. "Alara, you look well." "I am well," she said. "Thank you, Marcus." His smile held, he moved on. She watched him go and felt nothing particular, which was its own information. A year ago, she'd felt the calibrated attention of these people like weather on her skin, always monitoring for threat. Now they were just people at a party, with their agendas and their calculations, none of which had anything to do with her survival. She and Damien moved through the room, and she kept half her attention on the crowd the way she'd learned to, reading the currents and the groupings, and she found Grant without looking for him, which was how it always worked. He was near the bar on the far side of the room, and he was performing at full wattage. The big laugh, the expansive gesture, the gravitational pull of a man who understood that presence was its own argument. But when he turned and saw her across the ballroom, his face did the thing that no one else in the room would have caught. She caught it. She'd spent 3 years learning to catch it. The micro-tightening, the inventory, the rapid recalculation behind the winter sky eyes. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. She didn't smile, and she didn't look away. Then she turned back to the person Damien was introducing her to, and she let Grant stand across the ballroom with the knowledge that she had seen him, and that she was not afraid of him, and that she had come here tonight wearing dark green. Dinner was served. They were not at the same table. She'd confirmed this through channels she wouldn't have known how to use 12 months ago. But the room was configured so that she could see him if she looked, and he could see her, and this was the geometry Grant preferred when he was making a point, which meant he'd had something to do with the seating chart. She filed this and ate the salmon, which was exactly as bad as Damien had once predicted, and spoke to the people at her table with the quality of attention she'd been saving up for a long time. Real attention, the kind that didn't have a portion of itself constantly monitoring for threat. The woman to her left was a structural engineer who was rebuilding a bridge in the Bronx. They talked about load distribution and the physics of tension cables for 20 minutes, and Alara felt something she could only describe as the specific pleasure of her own mind being used, which was something Grant had been gradually removing access to for 3 years, and which she hadn't fully understood she'd lost until this moment of recovery. Grant gave a short speech before dessert. He'd been invited to speak. She'd known this, Vivian had known this. They'd had a conversation about whether it changed the calculus of attending, and she'd said, no, let him speak, let everyone see him speak, and then let them see what the hearing revealed in 2 days. He stood at the podium, and he was flawless, as he always was, and she sat at her table and watched him work the room with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years cultivating the performance of decency. And she felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter and colder. The feeling of watching a machine operate, understanding precisely how it functioned, having no more fear of it because you'd finally seen all the parts. He looked at her once during the speech. Just once. A fraction of a second, deliberate. The look of a man who was delivering a message he was confident she could read. She read it, and she held his gaze and she very slightly shook her head. One small movement. No audience. No one in the room saw it. Just Grant, who saw it, who understood it, whose expression did something she'd never seen it do before. He looked away first. It happened near the end of the evening, which she'd also expected. He always waited for the moment when defenses lowered, when people had been eating and drinking long enough to be soft at the edges, when the ambient warmth of a successful event created the social conditions he was best at exploiting. He came across the room with a glass of something amber and his shoulders set with the controlled ease of a man who had planned his route, and the people between them parted with the unconscious accommodation that powerful men in rooms like this always received. And she watched him come and felt her pulse do one elevated thing and then settle. Damien was beside her. She put her hand on his arm. "Stay here," she said quietly. He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "This part is mine." A moment. Then he was still. Grant stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at Damien first. A look that contained a year's worth of compressed hatred dressed in social clothing. And then he looked at her, and up close the winter sky eyes had something in them she hadn't seen in 3 years of marriage. Something frayed at the edges. "Ilara," the warm voice, the public voice. "I think it's time we talked." "All right," she said. He blinked. He'd expected resistance, deflection, the defensive posture of someone who was afraid of a scene. He recalibrated in a fraction of a second and leaned slightly toward her, dropping the volume to what he believed was private, but which she knew, from 3 years of watching him work rooms, would carry. "This has gone far enough," he said. "The filing, the affidavits, you've made your point. But what you don't understand is that everything you've put together, everything Vale's people have dug up." He shook his head slowly, with the expression of patient sorrow that she'd once mistaken for love. "It's not what you think it is. And when this goes in front of a judge, I need you to understand what the process is going to do to you." She looked at him. His face. The jaw and the eyes and the smooth certainty of a man who had never once in his adult life walked into a room and lost. "I know what the process is going to do, Grant," she said. "I've been preparing for it for 2 years. Something shifted. The photographs are gone. I have Preston Lyle," she said. "I have Carter Briggs. I have Sonia Dravant. I have the LLC authorization chain with your signature on 2 of 3 payments." She kept her voice level and quiet and completely without heat. "And I have a judge who is going to read all of it in 36 hours. His jaw tightened. The performance held, barely, but she could see the fault lines now, with a clarity she hadn't had a year ago, could see exactly where the structure was load-bearing and where it was decorative. "You think, I know what Maya Wren's settlement cost," she said. "I know what Carter Briggs's silence cost. I know what James Whitfield cost, and how much it's going to cost you when Whitfield's arrangement becomes part of the public record." She paused. "And I know that the reason you're standing here instead of letting your attorneys handle this is that you're out of moves, and you need me to make one for you, to settle, to sign something and go away." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to do that." The room moved around them. Conversation, laughter, the orchestra beginning to tune somewhere off the main floor. None of it was relevant. "You're making a mistake," he said, and his voice had dropped further, past the warm public register into something underneath it. The things she'd heard at 2 in the morning in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in the long accumulated private record of who he actually was. "You have no idea what Grant." She said his name the way you'd say enough. The last time you used that voice with me, I was standing in a kitchen with my back against a wall. I'm not in that kitchen anymore." She looked at him for one more moment, taking in the face she'd woken up next to for 3 years, the jaw and the eyes, and the emptiness behind the eyes. The whole architecture of a person who had decided a long time ago that other people were instruments, and she felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not forgiveness, nothing close to forgiveness, but a kind of finality. A door closing on something that had been open too long, letting cold in. "We're done here." She moved a step past him. His hand found her arm. Not a grip. Not the kitchen grip. Not the wrist under the table grip. His fingers on her forearm, in public, in front of the St. Regis ballroom. Reflex, not calculation. The calculation had failed him, and what remained underneath was reflex. The room went very quiet. Not all of it. Not like the glass. That silence had been sudden and total. This was a rolling quiet, the awareness spreading outward from the 3-foot radius of their confrontation like ripples, people turning, conversations halting mid-sentence, the social organism of 500 wealthy New Yorkers responding to the specific signal of something real happening in a room full of performance. Alara looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked at his face. She stepped back. His hand fell. She raised her voice just enough, just the precise amount required to reach the people who had gone quiet, not shouting, not performing, but speaking clearly into a room that was prepared to hear. "Don't touch me again." Grant Holloway stood in the St. Regis ballroom with 500 people watching and the orchestra suspended mid-tuning and his hand at his side where it had just been denied. And for the first time in the 3 years she had known him, he had nothing. No recovery, no pivot, no version of the next 30 seconds that served him. Damien stepped forward, unhurried, no drama in it, no theater, just the movement of a man placing himself in a space with the complete authority of someone who belonged there. "I think you know where the exit is," he said to Grant, and his voice was the quiet one, the flat one, the one she had first heard on a terrace in October asking if the salmon was good. And it contained nothing threatening and nothing uncertain, and it landed in the room like a weight being set down. Grant looked at him. Then he looked at the room, at the faces turned toward him, at Marcus Hale near the bar with an expression Grant would have once been able to rely on and could no longer read, at the 100 small calculations visible in the eyes of people who had been calculating their proximity to Grant Holloway's power for years and were now recalculating in real time. He left, not quickly. He was too controlled for that. He walked out with his shoulders level and his jaw set and his glass still in his hand, and the room watched him go with the particular silence that meant everyone present was revising a story they'd been telling themselves. The orchestra finished tuning. Music filled the space. Conversation resumed around them, changed in tone, the event reassembling itself around a new center of gravity. Damien looked at her. She looked at her own hands. They were steady. She'd known they would be, but she confirmed it anyway. "All right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it completely. The hearing lasted 4 hours. She sat beside Vivian at the plaintiff's table and watched the judge. A woman in her 60s with the face of someone who had seen the full range of what people were capable of and had stopped being surprised by any of it, read through the documentation with the focused attention of someone doing actual work. Grant's legal team made their arguments. They were good arguments. Technically, she could recognize the craft even now, but they were arguments being made against a complete evidentiary record, and she watched the judge's expression as she read the authorization chain, as she reviewed Preston Lyle's affidavit, as she listened to Sonia Dravant's testimony played from the recording, and she understood that the arguments were technically good and fundamentally insufficient. The injunction was denied. The asset freeze proceeding was reinstated. The LLC payment pattern was flagged for referral to the DA's office for review of potential criminal exposure. Grant's lead attorney asked for a recess. The judge gave him 5 minutes. During those 5 minutes, Vivian's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 40 seconds, ended the call, and looked at Alara with the expression of someone delivering news they'd been waiting a long time to deliver. "He wants to settle," Vivian said. "Terms?" Vivian told her. She looked at the courtroom ceiling, the old plaster, the institutional fluorescent light. She thought about what she'd said to Sonia Dravant on the phone in Damien's kitchen at 5 in the morning. I am not losing this because a man I trusted for years had someone in Vivian's office and got there first. No NDA, she said. He won't. No NDA, she repeated. His financial records become part of the public divorce filing. The LLC payments are disclosed. Everything Carter Briggs documented is on the record. He keeps his apartments and his development portfolio, and I want a settlement that reflects my actual contribution to the household over 3 years, including the career I suspended, and I want it done by the end of this recess. She looked at Vivian. Those are the terms. If he says no, we go back in front of the judge. Vivian picked up her phone. Grant said yes to everything. Vivian told her this with a flatness that she understood was Vivian's version of barely contained disbelief. She nodded and felt the news settle into her body. Not triumph, not the dramatic release she might have anticipated, but something much quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing completed. A weight set down after being carried so long she'd forgotten she was carrying it. Outside the courthouse, the October air hit her like something clean and real. She stood on the steps and breathed it in. Cold, car exhaust, the specific smell of New York in fall, the city going about its business around the event of her life with the indifference that she had always found, paradoxically, comforting. She was not the city's concern. She was her own concern. This was correct. Damien was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He'd been outside for the last 2 hours. He'd known this was hers to complete, had understood it with the particular instinct of someone who had never once tried to take something from her, which she had spent weeks learning to receive without suspicion. He looked up when she came down. She stopped on the step above him so they were level. "It's done," she said. He looked at her face, reading it the way he always did, directly, without flinching from what he found there. Then he nodded once. "What do you need right now?" he said. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which was itself something she was relearning, the habit of knowing what she needed, which Grant had been slowly removing the infrastructure for over 3 years. "Coffee," she said. "Real coffee. Not from the machine at Vivian's office." "I know a place," he said. "Mstats." They sat in a coffee shop on a side street in Lower Manhattan for 2 hours. She didn't check her phone. She didn't think about the filing or the record or what the DA's office would or wouldn't do with the LLC information. That was a door that was open or closed based on things outside her control. And she'd done what she could, and Carter Briggs would know the notes had been used, and Sonia Dravant was in Seattle with her daughter, and Preston Lyle had his witness protection and his conscience and whatever he was going to build from here. She drank her coffee and she talked to Damien the way she hadn't talked to anyone in years, not managing the conversation, not monitoring for threat, not performing the version of herself that was safe to present. She talked about the dissertation she'd written, about Edith Wharton and Lily Bart, and the peculiar grief of a character who understood her own trap with perfect clarity, about what it had meant to her at 26 and what it meant to her now, and how the difference between those meanings was the education she hadn't sought and couldn't return. Damien listened the way he always listened, completely, without the restlessness of someone waiting for their turn to speak. He told her about his mother, about the house he'd grown up in, about the specific shape of powerlessness that he'd carried through his 20s and had eventually converted into the architecture of the life he'd built. He told her about the first time he'd stood in a room where someone was doing to another person what had been done to his mother and had felt, for the first time, that he had the capacity to intervene. He didn't say her name, but they both knew which room it was. She looked at him across the table. This contained scarred, precise man who had built a wall around what had been done to him and had, inexplicably, used that wall to protect someone else, and felt the clarity of something she'd been approaching for weeks. "I don't know what this is," she said. "What we are. I don't have a category for it." "No," he said. "I'm not ready to know," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I need—" She paused, finding the honest words. "I need to know who I am when I'm not surviving something. I've been surviving something for 3 years, and I've spent the last 4 weeks surviving the end of surviving, and I don't actually know what I'm like when nothing is on fire." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "That doesn't bother you?" "No." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, New York passed the window in its ordinary afternoon configurations. People with coffee cups and dogs and deliveries, and the 10,000 private emergencies that constituted a city. Then he said, "Because I've been waiting for something I didn't have a category for either, and I'm in no hurry." She held that, let it sit without trying to manage it. "Okay," she said. Mab. The months that followed did not resolve cleanly. She had not expected them to. She rented an apartment in Brooklyn Heights, small, second floor, with a window that looked onto a street with old trees whose roots were buckling the sidewalk. She furnished it slowly, choosing things for herself with the deliberate pleasure of someone reclaiming a faculty they'd been told they didn't have. She bought a desk first, before a bed, which told her something about what she'd been missing. She called her sister in Portland. That conversation lasted 3 hours and covered 3 years of things she'd been routing around, and it was hard and incomplete and necessary, and she felt, afterward, the clean exhaustion of honesty, which was different from the grinding exhaustion of maintenance. She started writing. Not the dissertation. She'd been done with that for years, and what she was doing now was different, the thing she'd been circling since she was 26 and had wept over the ending of a novel, and hadn't understood what she was mourning. She wrote in the mornings, at the desk she'd bought first, in the light from the window with the old trees. She wrote badly for several weeks, and then less badly, and then, one morning in late November, something that felt true. The DA's office opened an investigation into the LLC and the payments. She gave a deposition. It was not comfortable. She was precise and complete, and she sat in that room for 4 hours and described what she had seen and documented. And she thought about Maya Wren once, a woman she'd never met, 26 years old on a floor that hadn't been inspected, and she was more precise in that section of the testimony than in any other. She did not follow Grant's coverage closely. She knew what she needed to know, that the investigation was ongoing, that his financing for 2 projects had dried up as institutional partners quietly withdrew, that the social page items about him had a different quality now, the warmth replaced with something more cautious. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She felt something more accurate, the recognition of consequence, which was different from revenge and more sustainable. Carter Briggs called her once. He said he'd read the deposition transcript. It had been a matter of public record, and that he'd found in it what he'd been unable to put in his own story 7 years ago. He didn't say thank you. He said, "It's a good record." She said she knew. He said he might write something. She said she thought he should. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she. And she thought about him afterward, sitting in his Carroll Gardens apartment, with the laptop open to something finally worth writing, the old sharpness maybe coming back to his eyes. Sonia Dravant sent an email in December. 2 sentences. It said, "I read what you filed. I'm glad it's on the record. No signature, just her name in the address line." Alara read it twice and then went back to the thing she was writing. She saw Damien on Tuesdays and some weekends. Not by arrangement exactly, more by the gradual accumulation of a routine that they hadn't designed, that had assembled itself out of the specific gravity between 2 people who had chosen, separately and then together, to be in proximity to each other. He came to her apartment sometimes and sat in the chair near the window while she wrote, not talking, reading something of his own, the particular companionship of 2 people who were comfortable sharing a silence. She went to Brooklyn Heights on other evenings and they cooked in the heavy kitchen. Or he cooked because cooking was one of the things he was better at, a fact she'd observed without embarrassment. And they talked about things that were not the case, not the proceeding, not the accumulated wreckage of the last year. He told her about the building in Red Hook he was developing, a mixed-use project he'd been slow with because he wanted to get it right. She told him about the structure of what she was writing, the shape of it, the way it was surprising her. He asked the right questions. She gave him the real answers. She was learning what she was like when nothing was on fire. She was, it turned out, someone who laughed more than she'd remembered. Someone who had opinions about food and asked for what she wanted and fell asleep at 9 on weeknights and woke up early and walked to the coffee shop on the corner before the city was fully awake, and stood in the cold with her cup and watched the light come up over Brooklyn, and felt something she hadn't had language for in a long time. She had it now. It was not happiness exactly, not the simple kind, not the uncomplicated kind. It was the feeling of being exactly where you were, with the full knowledge of what it had cost to get there, and finding that the cost was real, and the place was worth it. One evening in January, late, they were sitting in her apartment. She was on the couch with her legs folded under her. He was in the chair, the lamp on, and the street dark outside. And he said without looking up from what he was reading, "The marriage paperwork." She looked at him. "The divorce is final," he said. "The convenience arrangement is legally dissolved with it." He set his book down and looked at her directly. "I want to be clear about something." She waited. "I want to be with you," he said. "Not because of the case or the arrangement or anything that was a structure we built to survive something. I want to be with you because you're someone I want to be with." He held her gaze with the directness she'd come to understand was simply how he moved through the world. No decoration, no obscured intention. What you saw was what was there. "And I understand if you need more time. I told you I'm not in a hurry, and I meant it." She looked at him for a moment, at the scarred hands and the controlled face, and the dark eyes that had looked at her on a terrace in October, and set down a card without theatrics and said, "I'm not asking you to trust me." She unfolded her legs and stood up and crossed the small apartment and sat on the arm of his chair, and he looked up at her, and she took his face in both her hands the way you'd hold something you intended to keep. "I don't need more time," she said. He put his hand over hers and held it there, his thumb against her palm, the warmth of it specific and real and belonging to no one's performance. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, the lamp threw its circle of light across the room she'd furnished for herself, the desk she'd bought first, the window with the old trees, the particular order of a space that had been arranged by someone who knew what they wanted and had allowed themselves to want it. She had been 31 years old and weeping over the ending of a novel and hadn't known what she was mourning. The woman who finally understood her trap too late, who fell in carefully observed stages toward a ruin she couldn't prevent. She was 34 now. She was sitting in her own apartment with her hands on the face of a man who had looked at her in a dark ballroom and seen something worth protecting, and she had protected herself. And the story she was writing was not a tragedy, and the light from the lamp was warm, and outside Brooklyn went on in its ordinary and indifferent way, and she was, without qualification, entirely herself. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was, in fact, everything.